There's one thing all of your favorite movies, books, and television shows have in common, and that is character and story conflict. So by definitions, conflict is just the struggle between two opposing forces. It's just that simple. And as simple as that might sound, you'd be surprised how many writers often forget this crucial ingredient when they're telling their story. We even see it in a lot of popular movies, at least the ones that aren't that good. Anyway, today we're going to go over some examples of what good conflict looks like, the different types, and several ways you can create it. But before we dive into what each type of conflict means, I want to make something clear first. When you think of conflict, don't think that it always needs to be something that's completely over the top in order to be effective. For example, it doesn't have to be some massive fist fight in public. It doesn't have to be some huge nuclear explosion. And it doesn't have to be some ridiculous attempt to overthrow the government. Just keep in mind that you always want to provide some type of purpose with your conflict, and you want it to be attributed to your character's development in some kind of way. Now let's talk about what types of conflict you can use to move your story forward. First off, character versus self. And then we have character versus character. Character versus society, character versus supernatural, character versus technology, and character versus nature. You may hear the word character be interchangeable with the word man, like man versus self or man versus nature. Now, you'll notice that each type of conflict I just named falls into two categories, and that's either internal or external conflict. Let's talk about internal conflict first. So, internal conflict is when your character struggles for something within themselves. It can be a belief or some type of desire. In the movie Fight Club, the main character played by Ed Norton struggles with a life of extreme boredom. Everything in his life is so routine, it's literally driving him insane. He has been on cruise control for so long in his life, he doesn't even know how to go after his main need, which is living his life with purpose and being fulfilled. Of course, that all changes with the inciting incident when he meets another character named Tyler Durden, played by Brad Pitt. Now, the external conflict is something or someone standing in the way of your character's needs or goals. This is going to be some form of external force that creates tension throughout the story. An easy example for this could be how Marty McFly in the movie Back to the Future is constantly bumping heads with the high school bully named Biff. Marty has a pretty straightforward goal. After a time-traveling experiment goes awry, he ends up in the 1950s, inadvertently screws up his fate by being there, and his goal is to make sure his mom and dad fall in love, otherwise he will cease to exist. The constant external conflict and tension rises as Biff constantly punks Marty's dad and physically harasses his mom in high school to the point where his dad decides to not even ask Marty's mother out on a date. That's a big problem. If they don't have a date, they can't fall in love. If they don't fall in love, then Marty doesn't get born. So the examples we just covered when discussing internal and external conflict covers 2 of the 6 types of conflict we're covering today. They fall into our previous categories of character versus self and character versus character. Next, we're going to talk about character versus society. Now, keep in mind that societies are made up of people, so in essence, this one is sort of like character versus characters in a way. A good example of character versus society would be if your protagonist was fighting against his own government, or if they were on trial for a crime they didn't commit. Essentially, your protagonist is going against the grain and against the status quo. Remember that movie, The Fugitive? Harrison Ford played Dr. Richard Kimball, a man who escapes from the law in an attempt to find his wife's killer and clear his own name. There's a massive manhunt going on to bring him in and being led by U.S. Marshals hell-bent on his capture. Now, Richard Kimball is by all means a law-abiding citizen, but that same law that was put in place by society to protect him could get him a life sentence or the death penalty in this particular scenario, so he takes matters into his own hands. Some additional examples would be movies like V for Vendetta, The Hunger Games, John Q starring Denzel Washington. All 3 of these movies are good examples of where the protagonist takes matters into their own hands and goes toe-to-toe with society in some kind of way. Next up is man versus supernatural, and this is something that we typically find in horror and sci-fi movies. A good example of this would be the movie The Shining by Stanley Kubrick, based on the Stephen King novel. Now, this story is based on a character named Jack Torrance, an aspiring writer who visits an isolated historic hotel called the Overlook Hotel with his wife and son, who is gifted with the psychic ability called The Shining. During their visit, a bunch of unexplained events take place and Jack loses his damn mind. Now, there's a difference in the execution between the novel and the movie. In the novel, the protagonist is in the Overlook Hotel and it's the hotel itself that's haunted. There's ghosts and other haunted things that are apparent to anyone with a set of eyeballs, but in the movie, we are under the impression that all the creepy things happening is just a part of his descent into madness. Overall, both story versions fit into the man versus supernatural category because Jack's struggle is with the hotel and unexplained events, as well as his sanity. When we get into talking about things like character versus technology, this is the type of conflict that we see in movies like The Terminator, the movie Her, Minority Report, Christine, I, Robot, Ex Machina, Chappie, RoboCop, or a movie like Interstellar. A few things to keep in mind when using man versus technology conflict. Make sure you actually understand the technology that you're writing about. Educate yourself on the technology that actually exists and what may be in the works. There's nothing worse than a writer who's telling a story about technology that they don't fully understand. Ask yourself how this technology fits into the lives of your character. In the movie I, Robot, Will Smith plays a technophobic cop who investigates a crime that might have been committed by a robot. That premise alone gives us an idea of the conflict that lies ahead between those two once they come in contact with each other. And finally, character versus nature. When we explore character versus nature, we find that our protagonists often face elements of nature that are completely out of their control. The protagonist either struggles to solve, survive, or overcome that conflict in order to gain control back in their life. Some good examples of this are movies like The Day After Tomorrow, Castaway, 127 Hours, The Life of Pi, The Grey, or The Martian, starring Matt Damon. Overall, if you're having trouble writing your story or you're stuck in some type of way, make sure that the conflict between your characters and their goals are compelling. You can't move a story forward effectively without conflict. Regardless of the genre, always remember that conflict is the soul of your story. Without conflict, your characters are just going to be going through everyday life where only the most uninteresting events are being highlighted in the story. In the next video, we'll talk about different ways you can create conflict. Until then, keep writing. In the meantime, make sure you check the links in the description and get on the mailing list for more content like this. Peace.